Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Responding to some of your responses and some of your comments, of course, on YouTube, on SubStack, and even some emails over the last couple of days. And thank you, by the way, for those that are subscribing. We really do appreciate your support on that. But one of them asked about this pending Supreme Court decision that's coming down in the States right now about Donald Trump's tariffs. And the question was, if the court rules against Donald Trump and said the tariffs are illegal, as some of the lower courts have done, does that mean all those companies get their money back? Does that mean Algoma, that just laid off 1,000 people here in Northern Ontario a day or so ago, can sue the U.S. government and get all that money back because most of their business is done down in the States? The short answer is it's complicated. And the long answer is a lot more complicated than even that. But it does hinge an awful lot on what the Supreme Court is going to say. And that's why so many of us on both sides of the border are watching this. Because if the Supreme Court rules against Donald Trump, what about the tariff battle that's going on right now between the Canadian government and Donald Trump? Does that mean that is off the table altogether and we can negotiate fairly with the trade deal? Well, we'll see what happens. And it really does hinge on what's going on right now. I mean, the fight of all of this is right now in the hands of the Supreme Court down in the States. And at oral arguments last month, because both sides actually made presentations to the Supreme Court, the court members seemed rather skeptical of Trump's assertion that he does have the power to tax imports at a whim. And so now you might think at home, gee, maybe they are going to rule against them. I'm a little more skeptical than maybe some of the people that are observing this right now. As we've talked about in the podcast many times, there are 9 justices on the American Supreme Court. 6 of them are hardcore MAGA people, including John Roberts, who used to be considered a moderate conservative. He's gone over to the dark side, as he has with some of these other decisions, and Amy Coney Barrett and the other guys that are Kavanaugh and all the other ones that are there. I don't see them going against Donald Trump. I mean, don't forget, this is the same Supreme Court that just a few months ago ruled that Donald Trump can do whatever the heck he wants, basically have carte blanche, and cannot be charged while he's the president of the United States for anything that he says or does. And it harkened back to, the famous line from Richard Nixon during the Frost-Nixon debates when he was talking about Watergate. And Nixon made the assertion back in those interviews, remember? Said, if the president does it, it's not illegal. And we were shocked that a president or even an ex-president like that would make such an assertion. That's totally against the Constitution, totally against the whole idea that the 3 equal forms of government, etc. Nobody is above the law. The Supreme Court has basically already ruled that Donald Trump is above the law as far as the United States is concerned. So I don't see them changing tact on that. But who knows what's going to happen in this situation, because there's a lot riding on this financially for the U.S. economy, certainly for the Canadian economy. We know that part of the things that are causing the grief now the lack of negotiations between Canada and the U.S. when it comes to trade is the rather precarious situation in the U.S. economy right now. And as we've said, don't listen to Donald Trump, who will tell you that everything is fine and, the money from the tariffs is coming in and we're rich again. I mean, just the other day, when he woke up from one of his snoozes right in the middle of a cabinet meeting, because there were 2 or 3 of those, he basically said that, we're going to be so wealthy in the United States right now that we may not be charging income tax to people anymore. Yeah, this is the president of the United States talking. Saying that everybody's going to get a rebate and you won't have to pay income tax anymore, that things are going so well. Well, that's not the case. We know that's not the case. But we know that there are some naive people, the MAGA people with the red hats and everything, that are just simply going to buy into that because it's Donald Trump that's saying it. So let me spend just a couple of minutes talking about some of the realities that are occurring there now and could occur depending on this Supreme Court ruling, and why we in Canada are watching this and paying close attention to this, because it is going to have an impact on possible trade negotiations, on a number of Canadian companies that are being impacted by these tariffs too. Now, here's what could happen. If the court rules against the president, that could force the Trump administration to have to pay back substantial portions of the roughly $200 billion that is collected so far since the start of the year. Now, the court says that they've shown little indication right now as to whether or not they would order such refunds, because that is a possibility. They could say, yeah, President Trump, what you're doing is beyond your reach. It's illegal. You shouldn't be doing this. But they could say, this day forward, you can't do it anymore. In other words, all that money that was paid is not going back to the people. Now, if that's the case, and that is a possibility, what I'm told from legal experts that I've talked to over the last couple of days is that that would basically mean the companies could still sue the government. That wouldn't be court-ordered from the Supreme Court, but Costco and some of these others that have already started the wheels in motion to try to get their money back would have to go through a long and protracted and expensive legal process to try to get their money back. That's if that scenario develops. They could also say, Trump, what you're doing is illegal here, and you have to pay it back. In other words, the government has to refund all these companies the money that they have been paying over the last little while. Now, Amy Coney Barrett, one of the Trump appointees on the court, says that's really looking like it would cause a big mess, which kind of indicates to me that they may actually say, no, you can continue to do this, Mr. President, because we don't want to see the huge burden on the U.S. government. In other words, whether it's right or wrong would seem immaterial. They just don't want to see Trump have to pay money out. That's not what the court's supposed to do. They're supposed to decide on the legality of this. But we already know that there's a huge MAGA bias on the Supreme Court these days, and that may carry the day. We just don't know. However, one of the lawyers that was arguing on behalf of all these businesses that are being impacted by this, negatively impacted by this, Neil Katyal, we've seen him oftentimes on what was MSNBC. He's a former assistant attorney general back in the days when the Supreme Court and the Attorney General's office were legitimate legal entities. Not so much these days, of course. But he said, "Look, there's all sorts of options. If you rule against Trump, he doesn't have to pay everybody back in one lump sum. It could be done on installments. There's a number of things, or pennies on the dollar. There's all sorts of options that are available here. So don't dismiss this just because it's going to be a big burden, financial burden." Trump says that if his government is forced to have to pay some of these tariffs back, or all of these tariffs back, that it's going to bankrupt the United States. Well, most economists that don't wear MAGA red hats said that's not true. It would be a big pain, obviously, but it can be done. Certainly it can be done. So, those are the arguments that are going back and forth here. What is happening, though, is something that's I find fascinating. And it's that some companies, and not just the big guys like Costco and some of the other ones that are looking at this, and there are some pretty big ones here. Revlon, the cosmetic company, is another one of these companies that is now preparing legal arguments to try to get all their money back that they've had to pay in tariffs. Valeo North America, which is an automotive supplier, Interstate Batteries, Kawasaki, a number of major companies, Bumblebee Foods, that make the tuna down there, and food processing and things like that. They're all getting in line right now and hiring these expensive, I would imagine, legal teams to try to fight the Supreme Court, or to fight the government and try to get their money back, because they're hurting. As we've talked about in previous podcasts, one of the ways that many of these companies and an awful lot of people in the U.S. economy have tried to exist during all these Trump tariffs is to simply, first of all, many of them stockpiled product before the tariffs went into effect, so they still have things in the warehouse. So, if I wanted to go and buy a Kawasaki, for instance, I probably wouldn't be impacted by the tariffs, because that Kawasaki that's in the factory or in the warehouse was not impacted. Well, they're running out of stock, so now they have to order new stuff, and of course they're paying the tariff on it, so those prices have gone up. The price of tuna has gone up. The price of bread has gone up. The price of everything in the States has gone up, despite what Trump would say to the contrary. So they're looking for some relief right now. And what they're trying to do here is to try to get this money back so that they can put themselves back in a level off financial situation and not have to impact consumers to the extent that they're doing that. It's a laudable cause, right? Now, not everybody can do that. Some of the smaller companies that have been impacted, and you got to figure that their impact is going to be even more egregious, because they don't have this big, huge windfall or the profits of a Costco or anything else. Small to medium businesses have also been impacted by this. And they say, yeah, we want our money back too, but we can't wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years of legal battles, nor can we afford that. So what they're doing now, and this is an interesting concept, is they're doing some calculations now as to how much they've paid in these tariffs and how problematic and how punitive it's been to them, and they come up with a dollar figure. And then there are companies right now that are calling on them and saying, we'll take over your what is your debt, actually, your tariff debt, in the anticipation that the government's going to have to pay it back. So if it was, say, $500,000, he said, we'll buy that from you for 200,000, 300,000. And the companies are looking at that and saying, that's a better deal. At least I'll get that money right now as opposed to having to wait, for 4 or 5 years, et cetera. So it's like when you do your income tax every year, right? And there are companies, that'll say, look at, I know that you're going to get $1,000 back. You can't wait 6 or 8 weeks for the government to give that money back. We'll give you $700 right now. And when that money comes in, we'll take the $1,000. And lots of people do that because they want the cash right now. And small businesses are starting to do that down in the States. It's not maybe good business, but it's something that they have to do. They're being forced to do. And it's all because of the Trump tariffs. And we're just now starting to understand just how impactful these tariffs have been on American businesses. Because so many people, for the longest time, have bought into Trump's argument that, no, it's the foreign companies that are paying the tariffs. It's the Canadian government or the Europeans that are paying those tariffs. And all that money flows to the American people. Well, the reality is we've known from day one, is that, look at the companies in the North America, and especially in the United States, they're the ones who pay the tariffs. Now, if Kawasaki has to bring in product from wherever, Europe or whatever, they pay the tariff, and they pass that on to the consumer. And Trump didn't seem to want to understand that, or just was basically lying to the American people. Well, now the chickens have come home to roost, and they understand just how this process works. So there's going to be immense pressure on the government if the court rules against them. Now, there's another option here, too, that may or may not come into play, is the Trump government could just ignore the ruling, which they have done in other circumstances, and simply say, well, that's too bad. We're not going to pay, because Trump has been famous for ignoring court rulings in the past. And if he did ignore a Supreme Court edict such as this, what would they do? I don't know. I know what they should do in a circumstance like that, for being in noncompliance, but I don't know if they would actually bring the hammer down on their buddy Donald Trump. This is a MAGA Supreme Court, and this is a MAGA president, so I'm not so sure that there would be any confrontation between the court and the president, nor would there be any situation where, they'd have to be some punitive damages to the president himself. So it's a messy situation. And here in Canada, we're looking at what's going on here because of the impact that it's going to have and has had on some Canadian companies. I mentioned Algoma just a few minutes ago. There's a company that just laid off 1,000 people, and they say the main reason for that is the impact of the Trump tariffs. Algoma, a longtime steel manufacturer, of course, here in Canada, but apparently most of their major clients are Americans. So that tariff has to be applied to just about everything they want to do. So business is slacked off totally. And that's tragic. That's sad to see that sort of thing happening. So, they may be looking to get money back. I don't know how these guys are going to address this. Softwood lumber companies, same sort of situation. So it does have an indirect impact on what's happening in the Canadian economy and to Canadian businesses. So we're all watching with great interest to see how the Supreme Court rules on this and just what's going to happen next. And the other element to this, too, is what about the interrelationship between governments? If the tariffs are ruled to be illegal, and let's just discuss that possibility at this stage, how does that impact negotiations between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico? As we're talking this week, initial negotiations and discussions are beginning between those three countries about revising the CUSMA deal that is coming up for revival anyway. It's sort of a review. It's going to be happening in 2026. Now, as for the timeline, we're told that it's probably not going to be spring or summer before they get down to some hardcore discussions about that. But, companies and businesses are all making submissions right now to this panel to talk about whether or not, the deal is a good deal and whether or not it's benefiting Canadian businesses and American businesses and Mexican businesses, the routine. And we mentioned on an earlier podcast that surprisingly, an awful lot of American businesses, large businesses, including Ford, General Motors, and many others, have already made submissions and saying, leave the deal alone. Stop with the tariffs already, Mr. President. You're killing our businesses. We love what's going on with Canada, the U.S., and Mexico with this trade deal. Don't ruin something that has been impactful and been very positive for all three countries. I don't know if Trump's going to listen to that. But if the tariffs are already, and by the Supreme Court decision here, if they are ruled to be illegal, which means Trump can't do those anymore, what's that going to do to change his philosophy toward that? That's a tool that he can't, that's a hammer that he can't swing anymore. Is that going to have an impact on what's going to be happening? vis-a-vis those trade negotiations and a possible free trade deal, because there are some options that are open there too. Now, we've asked a lot of questions on this podcast, and clearly, because of what's going on and because of who we're dealing with here in the White House, we don't have a whole lot of answers, and that's problematic, of course. And it's going to depend an awful lot on how we need to understand just how Donald Trump is going to respond to this. But, how do you try to find some sort of rational behavior in somebody who is clearly irrational? That's the wild card in this whole situation as to how these guys are going to respond to this, and whether or not it's going to lead to some clarity and maybe some easing of tensions between, not just Canada and the United States, but so many other areas and so many other nations that have been trying to deal with the United States. So it's a very important issue. Now, we don't know the timeline. We're simply told that it could come at any time. It may well be early into the new year before the Supreme Court rules on this, but it is the Supreme Court. And that's kind of the end of the line. Now, as I did some work on this, and I checked out actually an article that was in the New York Times today by Tony Rahm and Anna Swanson, two of their business reporters. And the article, by the way, in the Times has said, ahead of tariff ruling, businesses race to secure funds, which is a kind of a description as to what we just talked about how some of these big companies are preparing to go to court against the Trump administration, and how some of the smaller companies are basically trying to get some of their money back because of the tariffs they've had to pay. But they do also put another option out here that maybe too many people haven't thought about what's going to happen with the tariff ruling. That there may be some compensation that has to happen. There could also be a circumstance where they simply ignore this. Or I'm also told now, according to this article, that the Supreme Court might pass the buck and simply say, we're not going to rule on this, which I guess would really piss off the president. But on the other hand, if they ruled against him, that would really piss him off. They could simply send it back to a lower court and said, you guys decide. Now, I that would really just be delaying the inevitable as far as I'm concerned, because this has already gone through the lower court system, and they've ruled against the president. So there's a very strong likelihood that could happen again. But what it does do is it kicks it down the road for many more months and God knows how long, in which place I'm sure the tariffs would still be in effect. So it doesn't really help anybody if that's the way that they're going to go. So it's a mess. It's a legal quagmire, and there are brilliant legal minds on both sides of this issue, I suppose. Trump himself may be a Luddite, but there's some pretty smart people that get employed by this. Mind you, if you want to judge by the quality of the lawyers he's hired for his own personal problems and going to court, maybe not so much. But it's going to respond. We are rather going to respond to exactly what happens here because of the impact it's going to have on our growth here in this country and our trade deals with the United States. Because as Prime Minister Carney has told us time and time again, yes, we need to become less reliant on the United States. We need to foster other trade partners and develop new trade partners or enhance some of those existing deals. And that's already in play. We've seen some of the results of that already. But you can't ignore the United States altogether. That's still a huge economy, and it's right next door. And there's still many, many Canadian businesses that still rely on that cross-border traffic. So we need some semblance of peace and consistency and stability. Businesses, Canadian and even Americans who are not necessarily in favor of what Trump is doing, they understand that there has to be stability. If you want to get people that are going to invest in your company, whether it's for expansion, whether it's for new products, maybe to hire more people because of all of a sudden businesses getting better, there has to be stability. There are all kinds of people. There are apparently billions and billions of dollars available right now for investment, whether it's angel funds, pension funds, retirement funds, whatever the case might be. And they're looking for places to put their money. But they're not going to put it into an economy that's so unstable as the one that Donald Trump has created in the States. So there's a long-term benefit here to getting some stability. The long-term answer to that may be to getting Donald Trump out of the White House, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, we would imagine. So we'll be watching to see exactly what the Supreme Court is going to be doing. And then, of course, that's when the dominoes start to fall. And we're not sure which way they're going to fall or how people are going to respond to it. But it's a very important issue that with all the other stuff that's going on with sinking of boats and some of the other idiotic things that Trump has been doing, it's an issue that may have been shoved off to one side, to one of the back burners. But it's going to come back at us pretty soon. And as soon as it does, and as soon as the Supreme Court rules on this, then all of a sudden, there's going to have to be an action plan here from the U.S., from businesses in the United States, and certainly from our Canadian government and some of our Canadian businesses. And we'll certainly track that as it happens, hopefully sooner than later. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. We really do appreciate that. If you're watching us on YouTube, good to have you with us. Please hit that notification bell so you can spread the word to others. And as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, thank you to everybody for the subscriptions. Your support, financially and otherwise, is extremely important to us to help us carry on the work that we're doing and maintain this dialogue on these very important issues. Thanks to Madeline Kelly, as always, for the great work doing the production on this. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed. Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.